Day 277 of the Ukrainian War Map, also known as the Russo-Ukrainian War. Juzzy here, and today is another update as I take a simplified and down-to-earth approach to some of the most important happenings on the ground in Ukraine. And I'll start off with the Russian military losses, so as of the 27th of November 22. So in the last 24-hour reporting period, there's been an additional 600 Russian military personnel losses, so currently sitting on 87,310 approximately. Then we take a look at the Russian hardware losses, so armoured combat vehicles, an additional 8 losses there, tanks 4 and artillery 1. Then we'll jump back to the map, where there was yet another notable fire in Russia today, this time at an oil refinery in Angast. Now, this is actually pretty hard to see from this map here, but we'll see if we can get it. It doesn't allow me to zoom out that far, but it's basically just above Mongolia there, which is in sort of central South Russia. Now, although the Russian media have not yet reported the details of the incident, like the other recent fires in Russia, this one could have been due to anti-war activists, or perhaps because of the maintenance engineers being conscripted to the front line in Ukraine. Either way, being a Russian oil refinery, it does have its strategic military value. Then we'll move back across all the way to the Ukrainian map there, and we'll start out in the Sumy Oblast of Ukraine, where the Sumy governor reported that Russian forces attacked the border town community of Bilopilia, really up north there, with a grenade launcher, but no casualties were reported. And it should also be noted that the Russian forces perform regular shelling and the like, for instance grenade launches today, into Sumy from across their border, so the Russian border just above, seemingly in an attempt to keep some Ukrainian soldiers stationed here so that they don't get redistributed to other front lines such as the Donbass to help out the Ukrainian effort. Then we'll move into the Donbass region, where we'll start in the north here. So the Ukrainian armed forces are reportedly preparing for a major offensive in Svatova. In fact, a lot of reports suggest there is quite the notable deployment of Ukrainian troops, more specifically at the adjacent Kharkiv border region, which is just next door to Svatova, where really the largest Russian defensive lines exist in the north. In fact, through the assistance of the Sentinel-1 satellite, which provides radar-based high-res images of the terrain, it appears Russian forces have created their winter defensive lines behind Svatova, about 5 miles behind in all. So Russia started these defensive lines a number of weeks ago, and we seem to have a clearer picture of them now, where they extend about 20 miles north of Svatova and an additional 14 miles or so south, with a bit of a break point in the middle. And we even have some footage now to complement all of this. There's a straight line trench followed by dragon's teeth cope cones, cheap concrete cope cones, just placed on top of the ground and not dug in. And in some cases, the towing bar is still on these things. Then moving on, there has been an explosion reported in the Russian-occupied city of Alchevsk, and I would suggest due to a Ukrainian high-precision strike targeting the supply lines. In fact, from memory, I do know this town. It's been struck before. There we go. We've got the logistical train lines running right through it. Then we'll move across to Bakhmut, so the ever contested frontline city there, where Russia posted a telegram message recently for the Ukrainian army in Bakhmut specifically to lay down their arms and surrender by 6 a.m. Now 6 a.m. passed and nothing happened out of the ordinary. And I guess you could say at this point Russia has tried a lot of failed strategies to take Bakhmut, although it's usually the same old unimaginative frontal assault tactics where wave upon wave of Russian soldiers have been eliminated. But this actually might be the first time that Russia seemed to ask a little bit nicely, just for a change of pace. But just to get back into the context about Bakhmut, so Russia wants and needs Bakhmut so badly. It's not even really for any real strategic military purpose, just the location doesn't do it any particular favors to take it, but rather it would be more of a huge symbolic victory for the Russian forces and Russia at large, because Russian state media propaganda would be celebrating it so much. But even if Russia did take this town, which I don't think they will, it's just a single town that would have taken countless Russian losses to obtain over a course of 4 months. Because Russia started shelling the town back in May, but really only commenced ground attacks or offensives in, I believe it was actually exactly the 1st of August. Then, speaking of Bakhmut, one of Russia's Zala tactical UAVs was downed. Although I might mention with that Telegram message, perhaps it did seem a bit ominous. One might suspect they're it's like a thinly veiled threat to, for the Russian forces to use incendiary munitions, but that would look bad for the Russian propaganda machine for a town that they're trying to capture. So maybe just an empty threat there. Then we move down to Avdiivka, where Russia is repositioning its forces to strengthen units at this location. So here it is. It's a very interesting spot, really. Now, weather permitting for the Russian forces, I would concede that there's a small chance Russia could take this town before weather becomes too inhospitable, just for a little bit of time before it gets into that hard frozen winter state. But Russia would have to act quickly with these reinforcements that are coming now. Because you'll notice how Russia has, in fact, encircled this town. But it's been encircled this way for quite some time, which is quite unimpressive. That Russia hasn't been able to take it in all of this time with the encirclement that's going on. Because I guarantee you, if Ukraine had an encirclement of a Russian-held town that looked just like this, the Ukrainian army would have taken it long ago. But maybe perhaps this speaks more to the ineptitude of the Russian forces more than anything. Then just quickly, maybe a bit more of a news piece, but a member of the Russian occupation administration was killed in a car explosion in Mariupol, likely from partisans in that region who vehemently do not want to be occupied. Then we'll move across to the adjacent Zaporizhia Oblast, where potentially the Ukraine forces are preparing for a large-scale offensive. Now, these are some stills from a recent video published by the Ukrainian forces. The location isn't confirmed, but using a combination of weather and battlefront environments, I would suspect that this, of course, wouldn't be Kherson due to the lack of river transport crossings at the moment. Then probably not Bakhmut, or the central and southern Bakhmut regions, as they're still muddy and wet at the moment there. Potentially it could be certain snowy regions of the Zaporizhia front line, which weather reports are fairly consistent with that possibility. Got Shavona, for instance. But still, an argument could be made that it is for Svatova as well, in the northern Donbass that I mentioned earlier in the video. Although it's always privileged OPSEC information, the armed forces of Ukraine are no stranger to giving the impression to the Russian forces that they're turning left but going right. Like a Michael Jordan head fake with that last second shot on the clock when he takes the championship winning shot. Which is really similar to what happened when Kharkiv was surprisingly liberated instead of Kherson. Then, speaking of Kherson, Russian forces continue to shell newly liberated towns across the Dnieper River in the region. Ukrainian forces respond with precision counter-battery fire at the moment, and reportedly Ukrainian Special Operation Forces, the SOF, raids are occurring as well. And take, for instance, Hola Pristan. So we'll load in there. Obviously on the south side, Russian occupied. Ukrainian artillery has been pounding this Russian-held position in the last day quite substantially. Then we'll just take a bit of a look at captured Russian hardware in this region. Surprisingly, we have a T-80 tank that was captured. It is said to need a little bit of repair from some damage, but otherwise should go back into working condition and redeployed onto the field soon. But on the Ukrainian side, usually we see a lot of T62s, a couple of T72s. I think we saw one T90 and one T80 is always a nice score there. Then we'll move across to the news for the day. So the Institute for the Study of War, a think tank, has advised that the pace of offensive operations will pick up for both armies in just the coming weeks. So at the moment, due to those wet and muddy conditions in many frontline regions of Ukraine, it's just impossible to perform any sort of effective offensive. Now, people like to say it's tanks that get stuck in the mud, but it's typically more so the supply trucks and armoured personnel carriers with rubber tyres that are the ones that are there to support the tanks, really, and they're the ones that instead get stuck in the mud. So when proper winter hits soon in these muddy regions, the ground will start to solidify or harden up for much better offensive conditions. Then moving on to another interesting news piece, the Belarusian Foreign Minister Vladimir Maky dies at the age of 64 unexpectedly. Now, the cause of death is not yet known, but I know you're already typing in the comments section, writing that he had an accidental fall out of a window, which is a fair enough comment. It happens enough in Russia, for instance, so why not in Lukashenko's Belarus as well? And to have your country's foreign minister to die all of a sudden unexpectedly is a pretty big deal, I would think. Just imagine if the US Secretary of Defense Blinken or Russia's Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov all of a sudden kicked the bucket. It would be huge news. And it's all happened during a pretty precarious international climate in the region as well. Now, there has been some rumours of foul play, but I prefer to deal with the political dynamics at play here. For now, so deceased Vladimir Maky was named to be a possible successor to President Lukashenko of Belarus, but at the same time he was known to be one of the few not under Russian influence, and that right there is a deadly combination. Putin, for instance, could not have a guy like this take the leadership position in the event that Lukashenko somehow no longer had a grip on power in Belarus. So that warrants serious consideration or food for thought. Then in some other news, the European Parliament offers Ukraine to rent the latest weapons from the West, and at the same time the EU can provide funds to rent. This idea was voiced by the head of the Committee on Foreign Affairs in the European Parliament, David McAllister, and seeing some traction with Ukraine getting access to modern NATO weapons of its choice would truly accelerate the change of balance of power in this region for sure. Then in some other news, German Chancellor Olaf Scholz announced that Germany will soon transfer 3 additional IRIS-T air defense systems to Ukraine, in addition to the existing Ukraine, the one that Ukraine already has, the single one deployed, that is. So additions like these are certainly timely in a bid to protect Ukraine's skies from Russian missile attacks on critical infrastructure during the middle of winter so that Ukrainian civilians can keep warm for one. And also note, interestingly, Ukrainians neutralizing air defense success rates currently sit at about 72% or about 82% of all missiles struck down, based on the last 2 heavy weeks of Russian missile strikes. Now, ideally, the international community wants to see that figure jump up to the highest of the 90s. You can never get 100%, but as close to it would be good, making it just too costly and untenable for Russia to waste tens or even hundreds of millions of dollars per barrage of missile strikes. And as far as my favorite Zelensky quote goes, quote, "When Russia's capacity for aggression is neutralized, it will have no option but to negotiate for peace." Not a very catchy line for a t-shirt, but I'd still wear it. Then in another Russian mobilization blunder, for this segment I'll switch gears today and show you what a Ukrainian soldier has been dealing with after 5 days on the front line. As you can see, the insides of his soles look pretty worn out, and he's going to get replacements. And this is the much less publicized stuff about gear resupplies for Ukrainian soldiers, but it's just as important because Ukrainian soldiers get a constant inflow of high-end wearable gear, sometimes even sent directly to the front line. Then specifically regarding shoes, we know the Ukrainian forces get good quality shoes, whereas the Russian forces, well, intercepted calls have shown they loved a pair of Ukrainian shoes that they just happened to come across and just despised their own cheap Russian supplied shoes and other gear. And I remember they didn't like their socks too much either. It was more of a bandage wrap as opposed to socks. Because Russian military conscripts all too often typically just get a single set of military clothes and that's it. In fact, there was one lucky Russian fellow that survived for about 6 months in Ukraine and was captured as saying through intercepted calls that he'd been wearing the exact same clothes for the last 6 months. Whereas in Ukraine, frontline forces get resupplies as needed in the middle of the night, supply runs as required there. So body armor, clothes, food, you name it. Needless to say, the Russian forces constantly get treated like garbage by their military and government because most Russian soldiers also complain that they only ever really receive one thing, and that's artillery shells. No clothes, no shoes, no small arms, no food, no water. Literally, some of them were drinking out of puddles, at which point they decided, screw this, I'm surrendering, and I feel like a Russian soldier's morale must completely be lost when he realizes he's getting treated better by the quote-unquote enemy than by his own country shortly after surrendering. And then just a bit of a funny to round it off with today, guys. So a bit of dark humor, I suppose, due to the nature of the content. But starting off, Margarita Simonyan, the editor-in-chief of a number of Russian state-controlled propaganda media outlets, that's right, more than one, spoke in a video address to mobilized Russian conscripts who complained about their poor conditions. And she was quoted as saying, "It's war, you're men, bear with it." She then goes on to tell a story of a surgeon on an Antarctic expedition who gets appendicitis, and since he was the only doctor on the expedition, he had to perform the surgery on himself. Then she goes on to say, and everything was fine, no big deal. Obviously, the moral of the story was for the Russian conscripts to be self-sufficient during winter. But a pep talk isn't going to stop the Russian forces from developing hypothermia when sleeping in cold and wet conditions like trenches on the outside at night. And I've already seen footage of Russian soldiers with hypothermia. Not a pretty sight. So hypothermia is basically when your body is losing heat at a faster rate than it can produce it. And that happens at temperatures of about 50 degrees Fahrenheit or about 10 degrees Celsius or lower. And it's now starting to get colder than that at night all across Ukraine. So we are really going to see some astonishing military ineptitude from the Russian forces in very high volumes really soon as temperatures continue to drop. Really an army of which should be very well accustomed to cold conditions from the present and history. And so, because I've gone down that unexpected path, here's a lighter video today to finish it off with, really, of Ukrainian personnel recently drifting in a BMP infantry fighting vehicle, or as my native dialect would call it, doing some doughies. So thanks for watching, guys. Please leave a comment, subscribe, hit that like button, and I do hope to see all of you guys there in the next one. Cheers.